But it's a very long chapter too, so bear with me and don't just skim. Don't just go where you always go in your mind, and let's see what the text actually helps us with. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered together at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Socoh and Azekah and Ephes Dammim. Something to bring out there is, where are the Philistines? You don't have to name those areas. Just tell me the general area the verse said they were in. They're in Judah, right? And Jerusalem, remember, we know, usually when we think of the association with God under the law, it centers around Jerusalem, right? Because that's ultimately where the temple is going to be built, and that's where the sacrifices are all going to be made. When Jesus is on the earth, that's where the center of their worship is, right? But it's not there now, is it? No, now it's in Shiloh, right? And they don't even have the ark in Shiloh. It's still sitting in the home of Abinadab, right? So we've got all this period of time that things are not centered at Jerusalem. And the reason is because if you remember, way back when they had the conquest of the land, Jerusalem was one of the places they couldn't take because they didn't do what God wanted them to do. Well, the people who were there were the Philistines. So now this has continued on through all of this period of the judges where they kept oppressing. And remember Samson, his account was about the Philistines, wasn't it? And so many people were killed in his final act, which was the only act really that was selfless in the judging that he accomplished for Israel. But that's continued on all throughout Saul's reign still. And so here they are. They're still in the area of Judah and Jerusalem, and they're still powerful, and now they're still opposing Israel, and now they've got this conflict that's coming again. It's happened over and over. Here's another conflict. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. So they're preparing to go to war. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. Now, stop just a second. Is there a danger with these two armies being on opposite hills and a valley in between? Is there a danger to either army? What's the danger? So, what he's talking about is what I mean. If there are two armies and they're on these hills on opposite sides of a valley, the first one to attack has to go where? To the valley. So in order to attack, you have to put yourself in a strategically difficult position, right? So it's easy to understand why these two armies are just sitting on these hills and no conflict has occurred yet, right? So the solution to that comes up in the next verse. A champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath, from Gath. Isn't Gath in Canaan? And it's not here where they're at battle, right? And it's not Jerusalem, is it? In fact, they had 5 major city-states in Israel, didn't they? And the rulers of those 5, Gath was one of them. So they've got a lot of footing in Canaan still. So this champion's from Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. Maybe you don't know how much a span is, but I think most people know how they measured cubits, how tall that is. Anybody know? 18 inches was 18 inches from elbow to the end of your finger was a cubit, so that makes 6 cubits is about 9 feet high. And then you add this span here, and what you get is almost another foot. This guy's almost 10 feet tall. His head could almost touch a basketball goal. That's a big guy, right? Okay, so that's what we know about him. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Anybody got a footnote or a note that tells you about what that weighs? 125 is what my note says. 125 pounds. 125 pounds. His coat of armor. And he had a bronze graves on his legs, so that's more weight, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. His spear weighed about 15 pounds. That's like a bowling ball that he's going to throw like a spear. What do we know about this guy? He's strong and he's big. We need to know that. Well, that's true. That area was where they were known to be from. What else? Absolutely. I mean, if you've got two armies on the side and you're thinking, I'm going to go down to the valley and put myself at obviously a disadvantage, well, this guy comes down and he's almost 10 feet tall, and he's got to be huge because he's wearing, armor that weighs more than a lot of people, and he's got a spear that the head of it is heavy as a bowling ball. Who's going to go out and fight him? He was their champion. Yeah, he's their best. And see, that's the way battles went a lot of times in the past, is rather than lose so many people in your army, you would choose a champion and they would fight against each other, and whoever's God won, well, that's just the way it worked out. And so you saved lives that way. But here's the issue. The reason God's telling us this is not so we'd be so able to tell our kids the story so that kids could talk about this giant Goliath and how huge he was and all that stuff, and how strong he was and all. No, the reason we're being told this is because there's nobody in Israel that's going to be able to fight this guy. The reason that, and I know this is the example I always bring up, but that's because I want to tie all this together in such a web that we can't forget it. But the reason we were told about the walls of Jericho was so that we would know and they would know there was no way they were taking those walls down when they attacked. The reason we were told about the size of the army of the Midianites that Gideon's 300 went against was so that we would know there was no way the 300 were going to win. Right? Okay, so the point we're being told right in the very beginning of this account with Goliath here and with Israel is there's no way that Israel is going to defeat the Philistines. There's no way they're going to drive them out. Okay, that helps us understand a little bit about why they're still in the land. Except for there is a way they could have driven them out, and there is a way they'll drive them out now. Well, they're not going to be gone now, but they're going to win this battle. And what's that way? It's got to be with God. Okay, and there's going to be a huge contrast between this champion Goliath that we've just been told about and a guy that's not even in the military of Israel. Okay, so let's keep reading. And then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So this Philistine is coming out, and he's huge, and he's shouting to them and saying, this is what I was talking about a moment ago. There's no reason for us to go to war. Just pick somebody, pick anybody, send them out here. And by the way, he's obviously been selected by the Philistines, right? I mean, he's not working on his own, is he? So they've sent out their best, and they're pretty confident in this because of who he is. He's their champion, which means this is probably not the first time this has happened, right? Maybe with Israel, but they've had other battles. So they just said, look, there's no use in all these people dying. He walked down into the valley in a disadvantaged position and yelled out to them and said, just pick anybody and send them down, and I'll tell you what, my people will serve you if anybody can come down here and beat me.
Israel has someone who is head and shoulders above everybody else.
And that was kind of why they picked him, wasn't it? Yeah. I don't think he was 10 feet tall, though. Yeah. Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was staying. And in fact, now that you mentioned Saul there, where is Saul and what's he doing? Yeah. He's back there trying to find somebody that he could send out because he's afraid, isn't he? And the whole idea of picking Saul, who looked, like Patrick pointed out, so tall and handsome and strong, was so he would go out and fight the battles, and now he's trying to find somebody to fight for him, right? That kind of backfired. Okay, so verse 12. Now we're changing gears just a little bit. David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. Now, we already know who David is, right? Because we saw him anointed by Samuel in the last chapter. We know he's the youngest, and of all these sons were standing before Samuel, and Samuel saw the first one and said, this has got to be him, right? And God said, no, I don't look on the outside, look at the heart, not him, not the next, not the next. Finally, to the end, and David's not even there, right? He's the youngest, he's out tending the sheep, and so he asked Jesse, who you got any other sons? Yeah, David's out here, but he's the youngest, bring him in, and that's when he anointed him, right? So he's the least of this family, and this family of Jesse is in Bethlehem, which is in what tribe? Judah. Judah. He is from Judah. And being from Judah, where's Jerusalem? What tribe is it in? Jerusalem's in Judah too. Yeah, this area. Where are the Philistines? Well, they're spread all out, but some of them right here in Judah, aren't they? So David's from the area where these people are inhabiting even. But we're introduced again to this Jesse. Jesse's getting old now, isn't he? Okay. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to battle. So there's 5 that didn't go, right? That means they're younger. If David's the youngest, he's young, right? The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near. Well, stop there just a second. That was what I was highlighting about the fact that he's not staying all the time at the palace, right? I mean, he's not going to feel bad all the time. He's not going to need David all the time. So it seems to be the case that what he's doing is he's kind of going back and forth. And when he's at home, oppressors have come in to oppress them, and nobody does anything for years. For years. 20 years, 40 years, 7 years. I mean, this happens over and over and over again, and finally somebody raises up. So this doesn't seem as bad, but it is the same pattern. They have sat here for 40 days trying to get somebody to volunteer. 40 days, he comes out, and he says the same thing. Just send anybody out. 40 days. What do you think they talked about at night after he went back to camp? You think there was somebody in the camp that other people were trying to talk into it? Come on, you can do it.
You can do it, Gary.
Yeah, you can do it. I've seen you. You're really good. Oh, no, not me. You do it. He has, but evidently he's not here. Evidently he's not here. Because you're right. He climbed the hill and fought and killed 20 people, didn't he? Yeah, so you're right. Or maybe he's afraid too. We don't know. What we do know is there's nobody able to talk anybody else into going. No matter how powerful. And we know who he has chosen to be in his army, don't we? What type of people did he choose? The best. He chose the best of their sons to come and fight for his army. So he's got the best of Israel. And there's not a one of them who has come to the conclusion that if God wants this done, which is what Jonathan said, by the way. Remember when Jonathan went into battle by himself with his armor bearer, and he said, let's make ourselves seen, and if they say, wait down there, then we know God doesn't want us to fight this. But if they say, come up here, then we know God's going to give us the victory. That's what he said, wasn't it? Not a one of them in this camp is saying, we can take this guy out with God. Not one. Well, they didn't have any. Yeah, but not of Israel. Yeah. Well, maybe they could have hired somebody. I don't know. It'd be expensive to hire somebody to fight Goliath if they don't know God, though. Yeah, not very many would want to face. I doubt there were very many of the Philistines would have wanted to face Goliath. But I want to make application from that. I wasn't emphasizing all that without a reason. I want to make application. Maybe you've seen several years ago there was a movie out, kind of a spiritual type of movie called Facing the Giants. Anybody see that? Yeah, and it was really about a football team, and they're conquering the odds. That's what it was about. But really the story behind it is all of us have these things in our life that are bigger than us. You know, things that you cannot handle on your own. And what happens when you try to handle these giants on your own is you make a mess of things, right? It doesn't go the way you want it to. And quite frankly, you get to this place where you give up. because you fought the giant and you've lost. You fought the giant and you've lost, and you fought the giant and you lost, and eventually you say, hey, I can't beat this giant. And so you just kind of exist in that place with this huge mountainous giant in your life that you can't win. And the point of that and the application from this is, if God's with us, we can fight any giant, can't we? As long as it's the one that God wants us to fight, and as long as He's fighting with us, right? So whatever it is that you're facing in life, whether it's loneliness, whether it's illness, whether it's addiction, whatever it is that you're facing in life, marital troubles, whatever it is that you're facing in life, it feels like this overwhelming giant, and you're thinking, I can't beat this giant by myself, but there's a way to win. There's always a way to win. But what we'll do is we'll sit there and let this giant in our life for 40 days, and nobody stands up and does the right thing, and it doesn't go away, does it? Anybody ever had a huge challenge in your life that just went away with enough time? You had chest pains, and so you thought, instead of going to the doctor, I'll wait it out. That goes well, doesn't it? Well, it doesn't go well with any other thing in life either. We have to say, you know what? It's been long enough. 40 days has been long enough. It's time to get on God's side and fight this giant in my life, whatever it takes. And here's the thing. It's not going to go away tomorrow. It didn't get there in a day. It's not going to go away tomorrow. It's not going to go away the next day. Might not go away next month. Might not go away next year. But there'll be progress. And that little bit of progress, that little bit of victory day by day, as long as God's going with us, allows us to beat the giants in our life. Okay, so let's go back to the text. 40 days. Let's see, 17. Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their thousands, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news to them. So back home, Jesse now says to David, I need you to go find out how your brothers are doing. Take some supplies to them. Oh, and take their commanders. Take their commanders some gifts. I just want to know how the battle's going. They didn't have the news to watch, to tell, or the internet to look it up on. They got to find out. Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So there's some kind of conflicts going on. Some small skirmishes going on here and there just to test the weaknesses of each other. People are evidently still fighting and dying. And it could all end if somebody would just stand up to Goliath, right? So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. So now he shows up at just the right time. They're going out to one of these smaller skirmishes. The whole armies are not getting in a conflict here. We've got small skirmishes that are occurring here and there along the battle lines, if you will, to try to figure out how to get the upper hand on one of these two armies. And he shows up while that's happening. Where are we? 23? 21. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. So evidently they haven't actually gone out yet this day. And so he just kind of leaves everything behind and runs out to see his brothers. Then, as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption in Israel. And David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. That sounds a little confusing that he said things multiple times. What we're being told here is that for 40 days, when this guy keeps coming out, the bribes have gotten higher. Maybe it started by saying, hey, who's willing to be the hero of Israel? Who's willing to go out and fight this man? Well, nobody volunteers, obviously. And so over the course of time, Saul has added things. Money, status, the king's son-in-law. Oh, and your family will never again be... What taxes did Israel pay? Well, they did. They did tax the king, but there was actually something else. There was specifically in the law the tithes that were set aside to support the priesthood and the worship of God. He's basically gone to the place where he said, you'll all be exempt from all of this from now on. Well, what right did he have to do that? But Saul kind of does whatever he wants to do in his own eyes, doesn't he? Like a lot of Israel. So basically, they've upped the ante. This has been stated over and over. So David comes in, and as he gets there, and he's just a kid, as he gets there, he sees this giant come out. He hears everything that he says. He looks around, and nobody's going, and he says, what's been offered? And they say, well, wealth, fame, son-in-law to the king, and you don't have your family. Your whole family doesn't even have to pay taxes anymore. Okay. Keep going. 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Stop there just a second. So Eliab's in the army, isn't he? He's been here for how long do you suppose? At least 40 days. That's the right answer. We don't know longer. But he's been there at least 40 days. So he's heard at least 40 days of Goliath coming out. How many times did Eliab step out and fight the battle? The same number of times the rest of the military men of Israel did. So when David says this, Eliab feels the guilt of it just like everybody else that's around, right? And siblings know the right buttons, don't they? And younger siblings usually have to fight for everything they get, don't they? Yeah, the older ones got to make sure they stay in their place, and that sometimes develops a little bit of a.
But David didn't know of this challenge.
He heard it just then.
Yeah,
he heard it just then. Yeah, he didn't know before he got here. Yeah. Okay, so Eliab turned to his younger brother and said, "You always wanted to be like me, and you're not. I'm out here as a warrior. You're back there with those little sheep, few sheep, which means you're not important, right? I'm in the battle. You're not important. You don't know what you're talking about. Who are you to think you can come and do this?" Yeah, that's exactly what he is. He's been dealing with the sheep and running errands. While I'm out here in battle, right? So don't you come out here and tell me how I'm supposed to do this. Okay. Keep reading. And David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" And then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first one did. What did he say? Is there not a cause? What cause? Yeah. The cause in this battle is God, isn't it? Because so many years ago when they crossed over that Jordan River on dry ground, their job was drive the inhabitants out. God was going to give them this land that flowed with milk and honey. It didn't happen. That's still the cause, isn't it? Whatever God tells them to accomplish, that's what they're supposed to do. That's actually why would you ever stand up against your giant? Why? If you don't have a reason, you're not going to stand up. It's because you're tired of it. Guess what? What's it mean? In John chapter 10, I use this verse a lot because I think we need to remember it. John chapter 10 and verse 10, Jesus has been talking in this chapter about the sheepfold and how the sheep know the voice of the shepherd and he knows them by name, things like that. And then he talks about himself being the chief shepherd. And he said, "I am come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly." And I think I know the importance of knowing what waits in heaven. I understand that. But I think that we do that passage in our lives a great disservice when we take that and apply it to that place, because that's not what he was talking about. What he was talking about is life here. Does God want us to go through life crippled by our giants? No. Are we going to have a perfect life? No. But sometimes it's actually the giants in our life that allow us to accomplish the greatest thing. As the Apostle Paul was talking about his thorn in the flesh, and he said 3 times, I asked God to take it away from me, and he said no. And then he said, my grace is sufficient for in weakness, I'm strong. Saul said, in weakness, I am strong. Sometimes those giants are the best opportunity to honor God and live the better life, to conquer the giants. But is there a cause? You're not going to fight it if there's not a cause, right? You're going to give up. And so David's standing before these warriors of Israel, and he says, why are they even out here? If they're not out here for the purpose of driving these people out of the land and honoring God in Him giving them this land and having a land that flows with milk and honey, which they don't have, do they? The best parts of it are still in the hands of other people. So if there's not a cause, why are we even out here? And if there is a cause, why aren't we stepping out and fighting what God wants us to fight? That's his question. I'm not going to get close to done with this. 31. And by the way, Eliab's not the only one that said, I'm not going out. Everybody else answered him the same way. When the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Why would Saul send for him? I've been waiting for a volunteer for 40 days, right? Somebody's out there that's going to volunteer. I got to know who this is. So come on, I want to meet this person. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Now stop there just a second, because I can imagine this. Saul's in his whatever protected area of the camp. He's been waiting for anybody that'll stand up. All of a sudden he gets word somebody's willing to go out to battle, which, by the way, would be scary if you're the king, I would think, because if he goes out and loses, you're going to be losing your power, right? You're not going to know how to serve it. So that would be scary. And he knows he doesn't have any of these giants in his camp. So it's got to be a little scary. But on the other hand, now there's finally somebody who's willing to go. So that would be exciting, right? Exciting news. He's got to be excited about this. And then in walks David. How impressed is he? Yeah, he's not impressed at all. He's just a kid. In fact, you got no experience, and you're not even a big kid. I know sometimes I about my sports stuff I do, and I read about these kids that are being recruited in 9th grade, and they weigh like 290 pounds in 9th grade. Yeah, I think in 9th grade it would have taken like 5 of me to hit that weight. He's not like that. He's more like I was at 9th grade. That's what David's going to say next, so hang on to that just a second. But that's the point I want to make, and that's this. It didn't matter how big David was. It didn't matter how big Goliath was. It didn't matter that Goliath was a champion and David was a minor shepherd. He wasn't even a full shepherd. None of that mattered. He didn't have any training. None of that mattered because David wasn't the one supposed to be going to battle here, was it? And that's the question that comes up about those 40 days. Why didn't anybody else in this army have this idea in their head that, hey, there is a cause, God does want this done, and no matter how much I don't measure up to the giant standing out there hollering at us, God will give us this victory. Why didn't anybody else get to that place? Okay, and I don't want to be overly critical, because if you and I were in the same place, how many of us would have stepped out there? So I don't want to be overly critical. I just want to tell you and emphasize what we're being told here is why when Samuel stood before the 8 sons of Eliab, or 7 that were there, and God said, no, not that one, because I've seen his heart, and he's not a man after my own heart. That's not saying that Eliab wasn't a good guy. That's saying Eliab wasn't the leader that God needed them to have next. They got that with Saul, the first one, the one that didn't have the right heart. The next one's going to have to be different. And that's David. And that didn't start when he was old. It started when he was young. Keep reading. David said to Saul, this is what Will was talking about, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul, wait, I already read that. 34 is his response. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. I find it very interesting, a couple things here. One of them is David doesn't talk about his own ability. What he talks about is what God did for him. So he said, look, you're right. I was just a shepherd out here taking care of the sheep, but they were attacked, and, I had to defend them, and God took care of me, and I got confidence that when I go out against this Philistine, God will do the same thing. Okay? So he's saying here, you're right. I'm not a soldier. I don't have training. I'm not a big guy. I don't have skill, but I have God, and God has shown me what's trust. How do you get it? Yeah, you develop it. You earn trust. It takes time, doesn't it? Yeah, now maybe you're the kind of person that is just a naturally trusting person. And so you offer trust to people, and then you give it to them until they lose it, right? But then do you just give it back? Or does that have to take time too? You got to work together to do that, right? You got to build it up. Well, with God, that's the point of why all of this is recorded the way it is. We don't live under that old law, but all of that is recorded for us, so we see, hey, guess what? I can trust God. I can trust that God's going to accomplish what he has to accomplish. Not just when David's sheep get attacked by a bear and a lion, but when my life is dealing with something that is overwhelming to me. Not just because, when David's going out with Goliath, but when I have a giant, I can trust that I can beat this. Not because of in fact, I find it very interesting. The second thing here I bring out here is, this is the army of Saul, isn't it? And yet as David turns to him and says, look, God delivered me from the lion and the bear, he doesn't say, and he'll deliver me from this uncircumcised Philistine who has defied the armies of Saul. He didn't say that, did he? It was the armies of not just God, the living God. Remember Dagon, the god of the Philistines? When they had the ark and they put the ark in the temple, what happened to Dagon? He falls on his face. Put him back up. The next day he falls on his face. His head falls off. His hands fall off. He's not a living God, is he? No. So David says, no, these are the armies of the living God. And so I'm going to go out and fight. Well, guess what? I'm out of time. So I'll tell you what I'll do. Wednesday night, I'll try to speed it. I'll just try to pick it up here and keep going. And we'll try to cover the rest of this with the next chapter. I told you it's a long chapter, and I'm a little talky. Okay, let's close with a prayer. Father, we're thankful for the opportunity to be here, study your word today. And Father, we pray that as we deal with the giants in our lives, that we learn the lessons from the account that we're studying today, that we learn that the victory is always yours and that there is always a cause to honor and glorify you. Help us to trust in you at all times and never ourselves. Forgive us where we fail you. In Christ's name.